I'm Eric Newton, and this is The Together Show. We all know relationships take work, but what is that work, and how do we do it? As a former divorce lawyer, I've watched thousands of couples break up firsthand. Having seen the worst in relationships, I decided to try to help couples stay together.
When
so
I
on this
very
show,
first
we
went
talk
to
to
that
real
retreat
couples
18 years ago
and
and
find
had
out what
this
love
big shift,
really
when we
looks
got
like.
home, is I just kind of spontaneously said this to my husband with a huge smile and like absolute happiness in my being. I said, I don't need you anymore.
Welcome to the show, everyone. Thanks for listening. We're launching a radio show based on our podcast, and we're looking for questions from listeners about relationships. If you have questions or if you'd like some advice about your relationship, give us a call and leave us a message at 415-483-5112. And I'll include that number in our show notes in case you didn't get it just now. Now on to the show. When I first imagined launching our podcast, there was one particular couple that I would fantasize about interviewing almost daily. And that was Mukti and Adyashanti. Now, for those of you who don't know these two, Mukti and Adya are both fairly well-known spiritual teachers, and they also happen to be married, which, as you can imagine, makes them like catnip for me. Well, I had so much fantasy layered on the idea of interviewing these two that I wouldn't let myself reach out to them until I had hit a certain level of credibility with the show. But once I did, I emailed their organization for an interview request, and then I tried to pretend like I wasn't nervous. Well, I got the response. Adya said no, but Mukti said yes. As you know, I usually only record couples on this show, but I just couldn't pass up interviewing one half of my fantasy couple. So I took the train down, recorded this interview, and I have to say it was so much fun. We covered basically all of my favorite topics: fear, love, marriage, the idea of completeness, conflict. We even talked about the myth of enlightenment. It was like being in an existential candy store. So, as you can imagine, I couldn't bring myself to cut the interview short. So this is a pretty long interview, but we split it in two. And you'll have to wait until Thursday to hear Mukti's thoughts on love and intimacy, but trust me, it's definitely worth the wait. Now, I've been letting this interview marinate in my archives for a while, and we just hit the 100,000 download mark of the podcast on Friday. So with that milestone accomplished, I thought it would be the perfect time to release the one interview that ever made me nervous. So with that, let's go to part one of our interview with my very favorite existential teacher, Mukti. So, okay, now I think most of our listeners probably have never heard of you, and probably have never heard of your husband either. To give some context and a foundation for why I was so interested to talk to you, can you describe, as I asked you just before the show started, can you describe who you are and what awakening means?
Okay, sure, I'll give it a try. So, hello everybody. My name's Mukti, and I'm here with Eric at Open Gate Sangha, and this is an organization that was founded to support the teachings of awakening. Initially, I have my husband Adyashanti, and now the organization also supports my teachings, and those are primarily teachings to help individuals discover more knowingly who and what we are essentially in essence. Sometimes that sense of who and what we are is named spirit. Sometimes it's named consciousness or awareness. But regardless of what name you give it, there's some sense of the mystery of what we are that we can sense more deeply into and even join in a type of union experience such that our identity as an individual me, or sometimes spoken of as the ego, really is completely set aside in this union experience, such that we can really directly encounter the mystery of what we are, and so that the mystery of what we are can become known as our true and fundamental identity. And that knowledge of coming to know our true and fundamental identity is often spoken of as awakening. And in particular, I like to speak about it as this sense of the mystery of what we are waking up to itself through our own human consciousness. So it's not so much like our thought of ourselves is what awakens, but that in a sense falls away, and the essence of what we are becomes prominent and shining in our direct experience. And so my teachings are primarily in fostering that awakening through means of deep inquiry and contemplation, as well as meditation and quietude of being. But also my teachings can focus on supporting those who have had awakening experience to function with that depth of knowing, and to be able to express that in this world of time and space, or in this earth.
And is that because when people sometimes have that initial experience, they don't know what to do with themselves?
Oh, well, that's true. Sometimes they don't, and sometimes it can almost feel like being born again, and a sense that we are born as spirit more predominantly, whereas our initial birth is often spoken of more as our human birth. But this would be a awakening of our spirit nature that can feel like a real identity shift from the ego identity. And as those ego structures are no longer being functioned through, it can be disorienting and unfamiliar to people. And so I give context and guidance and help people navigate that territory.
And so when did you have that kind of an experience?
I had that kind of experience, let's see, about 18 years ago now.
Wow, that's a long time.
Yeah. I was 29 at the time. Yeah.
And were you married to your husband back then?
I was. Yeah. I was on one of his retreats when I had a big shift occur. It was a silent meditation retreat during which he also gave some inspirational talks.
Oh, that's very interesting. So he was leading the retreat, and you were married to him, and you were attending the retreat.
Yes.
That sounds, I wonder what kind of dynamic. It sounds almost like a teacher-student role in a way.
It was, definitely.
Were you able to have how did you have a teacher-student role and also a marriage and have it all work for you?
Well, it's interesting how it came about, because initially I was not a student, and we were first, boyfriend, girlfriend, husband, wife. Then he became a teacher later in our first year of marriage. And it was about another whole year later that he was offering this silent retreat that I attended. And it was during that those first months of him stepping into that role as a teacher, after his Zen teacher had asked him to teach, Arvis Justi. And it was during that time that I was checking out what he was doing and there to help support him and support the people coming. And I really had no intention of becoming his student. In fact, at the time I was already a very devoted student to an Indian guru named Paramahansa Yogananda, and who was no longer living, but I was very devoted to his teachings. And so I had no intention of becoming Adya's student, although we had a practice of meditating together, in the mornings. And that was kind of part of our lives, but he would do a Zen practice and I would do my yogic practice. And then when he took on this role, I was so curious that I started to just be drawn to what he was saying. And so I started attending his retreats.
So he'd already had an awakening experience, which is why I'm
Yeah.
guessing he was teaching.
Yeah. Before I met him.
Oh, before you met him.
And then after we were married as well, he had a few different awakenings.
Wow. So you met him after that had already occurred, and had anything like that happened? Anything approaching it happened to you up to that point?
No.
But did you have a sense that it was something that was inevitable, or it was going to happen, or did it feel like a vague future that only certain people got to experience to you?
Well, I was introduced to Yogananda's teachings when I was really young, about age 7, and he spoke about self-realization, which is another term often used for awakening. And so I was really devoted to Yogananda's teachings during my life. And so even from a really young age, my whole interest was, how I would have put it then, was in union with God. And so I was really oriented toward that, but I actually, curiously enough, never had the sense that it would be inevitable or that it would occur or it wouldn't occur. I was so engaged in giving myself to it that it almost didn't matter if it occurred or not. I just wasn't so oriented that way.
Well, that almost sounds like the state itself.
Well, yeah, but it was, but I also was going through all the, human stuff. It wasn't like a 24/7 thing.
Yeah.
Just the development of being a teenager and, going to university and all that kind of stuff. But it was like very deeply in my heart.
I think a lot of people, when they hear the terms awakening or self-realization, immediately go to enlightenment.
Yeah.
And when people think enlightenment, they think superhero mythology.
Yeah.
What do you say to that? What's the distinction here? Or
Yeah, well, the terms are used so differently by so many different people. I mean, probably for every person who uses the term, there's a different meaning. But I guess what I would say, to try and speak more directly, is that I had some context from Yogananda's teachings about different types of samadhi states that we could be in, that we could come upon, that might open us to new perspectives of being, which now I might say perspectives that would give us a sense of varying identities, like meaning, like identifying with being one with everything, or maybe an identity of being at one with the source of creation. Sometimes that's spoken of as emptiness or the void. So there's these different perspectives that people can awaken within a person, that would in some traditions be called different states, and they might be related to different samadhi experiences or come upon the heels of certain samadhi experiences. But like in the Zen tradition, it was really helpful when I was exposed to Adi's teachings, which were rooted in Zen Buddhism, which I hadn't been exposed to much at all. Well, certainly before meeting him, but even much before he became a teacher. And they speak about different kenshos, or I don't know if they would use this word, but in Zen, but kind of like spiritual breakthroughs, where you'd break through into certain you could maybe call them states or perspectives, or realizations would be the term I would hear the most often. Right. Realizations. So these would be, whether we call them states or realizations, they would be different stages that a person might go through, or how things might unfold in steps, or sometimes they can come as like a package deal. And they would all be leading to a very, very different experience of being, that's sometimes spoken of as the enlightenment experience of being.
Which is just an experience, right?
Well, it is an experience, but what is realized in the experience is absolutely. It's kind of like, let's see if I can come up with an analogy. Like when you wake up in the morning, you could say that you're having the experience of being awake versus being asleep. But not only are you having the experience of being awake, there's also some knowledge of your very existence. Wakefulness is not only an experience that you're having, it's also like an innate expression of what you are as a being of existence, or as an expression of life. So I know what I'm speaking of is really subtle and kind of tricky to get a sense of, but if you're listening now and you just can kind of sense in yourself, okay, when you wake up, you may tell yourself, I'm awake, and you may even in your mind kind of reflect on this sense of, oh, I'm in the waking state. But when your mind is quiet and it's not reflecting and it's not narrating, it's not telling you whether you're awake or, versus being asleep. And if you can imagine your mind being really quiet and still and not even knowing what those terms mean or that vocabulary is, how would you describe like your most basic sense of being when you're not even referring to yourself as an experiencer and you're not even referring to the experience of being awake? There's still something expressing, and that very something has the power to be extremely vibrant and conscious in your being. And when that becomes very conscious, and it becomes awake to itself, that's sometimes spoken of as realization.
And then what happens to fear?
Well, there's different kinds of fear. But typically in the bright shining dawning of especially certain awakenings, like certain powerful awakenings where your identity completely drops out of ego, at least temporarily, then there's this sense of absence of fear, because there's also a sense of an absence of the one who would be afraid. Now you still might have biological, adrenaline running through your system if a bus is about to hit you or something. But you may not have any narrative about it in the way that the ego structure might typically have. In fact, something like this happened to me once, not too long after that retreat that I was referring to some 18 years ago. I was in downtown LA, and I didn't know the area very well, and there was I was on a corner, and the street to my left was a one-way that ended in a T, and the street that it ran into and was perpendicular to was the street that I was about to cross, and it was also a one-way. So the traffic to my left coming from behind me was forced to turn right onto this one-way. But I didn't know that, so I was looking left and looking right. Everything looked clear, and I went to cross, not knowing that the street to my left behind me was having traffic that was going to be coming around my back and turning in front of me. And so when I went to step out to cross the street, a bus stopped like an inch away from my body luckily the bus driver caught what was going on. But then what was even weirder was I kept walking, like I better get across the street. And then there was 2 lanes turning. So just around the bus, another car stopped like about a foot this time, away from me. And then I just bolted across the street. I'm like, I don't know how many lanes are in this road. I just got to keep going because they're all turning into me. And I remember thinking that in that moment when I looked up at the bus driver through the window and I just looked straight into his eyes, there was just this absolute intimate connection with him. And it was one of the most remarkable experiences because I didn't have any fear of death, but my body had so much adrenaline, it was getting me across the street. And I thought, wow, this is really interesting to have an experience to be without fear, yet the body's survival mechanisms are absolutely functioning alive and well.
How long did that space last for you?
It varied in terms of that. I would still say to this day, I don't really experience a fear of death. I've been in different situations, but I have had other kinds of fears come back. And that's what's kind of the story that there's more to tell in this story of awakening, because when that sense of spirit awakens really consciously and brightly, it can shine so brightly that it outshines any vestiges of ego that have formed within us over the course of a life, and it can feel like there's no ego present and that no ego could ever possibly return. But mysteriously, most people that I've talked to, which is actually probably everyone that I've talked to, will feel like layers of ego layering back on that bright wakefulness. And so when I'm hearing your question, like how long did the state last where I was free of fear, part of how I'm interpreting that question is how long did I experience a freedom from a sense of self who to protect, or freedom from a sense of self that might be egoically conditioned to fear. And if I think about the question that way, I'd have to say that the biological fear of death, I don't know that it's returned, but some other fears have returned and have operated at various levels. For example, like perhaps like fear of not being accepted, or fear of failure, or fear of my potential to relate to someone in a way that they would find it hurtful or harmful, or yeah.
Well, sometimes when I hear about any kind of fear, I think, what's the fear below the fear and the fear below that fear?
Yeah. That's a great inquiry.
Right. And it almost always seems to lead to something along the lines of death.
Mm-hmm.
So what's interesting, if that's true, what's interesting about what you're saying is that the root fear was cut off, but there's still these branches that grew from it. Mm-hmm. So so first, do you think that that's right? Like the way I'm imagining it is accurate, that all fears are sort of rooted in this fear of death or nothingness at its core. And if so, if you cut that off, then why do these others flower, do you think, or continue to live?
Yeah, why do they? Oh, that's like the golden question, I mean, I don't know that there's an answer to the why, but I've seen that is so. Yeah.
I guess then another follow-up question along the lines of the superhero mythology of enlightenment.
Yeah.
When we do hear about enlightenment, we think of this guy, the Buddha, whoever the heck he was. There's this idea that he reached that state of absolute lack of fear total bliss, union with all things, and never left it. And
Mm-hmm.
it stayed at 150% until he died from dysentery, or however he
Mm-hmm.
actually
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
historically passed.
Yeah.
Um, but it's almost like what you're saying is that that doesn't happen. That's not
I
what's real.
I don't know that it doesn't happen. I mean, I think anything could happen, and probably everything does happen, but it doesn't match with a lot of the people that I speak to. Yeah. Or my own experience. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Well, now with that as a
Mm-hmm.
foundation, which
Yeah.
gives us all a sense of who you are,
Mm-hmm.
um, you're in a relationship, you're married to
Yes.
somebody who's in a similar state.
Yeah. 20 years now. Yeah.
You've been married 20 years.
Mm-hmm.
Wow.
Yeah.
Congratulations.
Yeah. Thank you.
And so, what happens to a relationship? What happens to a marriage generally? And then I have lots of specific questions for you.
Mm-hmm.
Um, when one of you or both of you has had an awakening experience and fear doesn't have the hold that it once did.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason I bring up the issue of fear is that from what I gather through these interviews and so much research and talking to people is that almost all of the pain that people experience in their relationship is somewhere in this gap between what's actually happening and what they think should be happening. And the
Mm-hmm.
reason that should is there usually is because it's rooted in some fear that they're trying to compensate for, and that's where most of fights come from. When
Mm-hmm.
people are fighting with each other, having upset with one another,
Mm-hmm.
there's this grand idea of something should be different than it is with you or with us, etc.
Mm-hmm.
And in some sense, what you're saying is that you didn't say this directly, but I got the sense that you don't have a whole lot of attachment to should.
I'd have a hard time quantifying it. You know, there's many stretches where that's true. I think that there could be. I still do experience, that arising sometimes, especially under like tremendous stress or something. Um, but in general, the sort of the underlying experience, I actually kind of I have almost like things happening in layers now, where there's like my relative human experience, and then there's a sense of who and what we are as the eternal that's more unflappable, you could say, and that doesn't perceive things in terms of should or shouldn't. And often now, like I'll be having, even for many years now, I'll be having experience like play out on like two levels or two layers, simultaneously. So I could say that like even if like the majority of my experience can't even perceive through should and shouldn't, sometimes there'll still be like some human preference that I want it to go a certain way, and that there's no reason it shouldn't go that way, type idea. I'm not sure if I'm answering your question. I get the theory that you're talking about for fight, arguments and stuff,
Well,
based on that.
I might have narrowed it down too much with that theory, because I mean, what I was asking is, what's it like now that
Yeah,
you're still in a relationship, you're a
yeah,
human being, you're married, for goodness sakes, the most
yeah,
intense human relationship we can really have,
yeah.
and yet you both had this awakening experience and have a different state of being in some way.
Hmm.
So how has it changed being married?
Well, I know I can speak to like a couple little vignettes maybe. When I very first went to that retreat 18 years ago and had this big shift, one of the things that happened when we got home is I just kind of spontaneously said this to my husband Adya. I just said to him with a huge smile and like absolute happiness in my being, I said, I don't need you anymore.
That's so great and so true.
And he was so happy for me because he knew exactly what I meant.
Yeah.
Somebody else might have been really upset or offended or something, but he knew exactly what I meant. And sometimes people will have heard me speak about that or Audie speak about that moment, and they'll often misunderstand it. It's not that I don't greatly enjoy being with him, and it's not that I don't actually need him at sometimes to whatever, like, do his dishes or, help me with the groceries or, just practical things. But what fell away was this sense of anything missing in myself that I was looking for someone else to fill.
Right.
And just with that utter knowledge that who and what we are is fundamentally complete and whole, that any kind of grasping that I had put on the relationship had disappeared. And that was so marked to me that I expressed to him, I don't need you anymore.
Yeah, that's so great.
And I was celebrating it, with him. And so that was like, that's a vignette I could share that really translates. Another thing was, at the time I was studying Chinese medicine, and I was studying all kinds of different patterns of ill health. And for some weird reason, I was trying these all on for size. Like, oh, do I have that? Do I have that? Or no, and I was trying in my learning process to get a sense of these. And I was very kind of fixated on my own health. And then when I had that big shift, it was like that whole topic of conversation with him fell away for the most part. I just wasn't hooked up like that anymore.
Was that a topic of conversation that was pretty common before you had that experience? Something you would bring up with him?
Yes.
How did he react to it back then?
Back then?
Yeah.
He was fairly patient. He knew I was going through school and learning all about health stuff. But it wasn't his thing. It wouldn't be like the kind of thing that he would tend to share about. He's more private, or more contained or something with that kind of stuff.
Are you saying that there's something, though, like fundamental about the post-awakening experience that you're not so concerned with questions of your personal health?
I think it's varied. I've seen people who've had different types of awakenings, and some of them are really interested in that still, and some are less. It also can just vary. Like I'm older now, so there's new health things to kind of discover and check out. And
I guess the specific thing I'm really curious about is this period of time that you guys had where one person had an awakening experience, and the other one hadn't.
Yes.
And the person who hadn't was concerned about these details about their body, and talking to the person who had about them.
Yeah.
I'm wondering what a person who had would say to the person who hadn't, who they also were in love with, about, oh, you're having these experiences that you're probably not going to care so much about someday.
I don't think he framed it in that way.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't think he would frame it in what was going to be happening to me in the future. He's very much like just whatever's happening in the moment kind of guy.
Yeah.
Yeah. But I get where you're going with it. And he wasn't hooked up that way, I think, ever.
Yeah.
So, yeah. And I kind of always was. And even to this day, even when I'm teaching and I'm feeling for when people feel like they're more aligned, I'll have this feeling that is well-being or health, or whereas he's all about truth. Like, okay, they're aligned with what's true. And so we each kind of have our different proclivities or interests or something. Like I'm kind of more about like, oh, okay, things are in harmony now, or, things are humming with well-being, and he would be more like, okay, that's true, that's clear, and that's more of his expression.
Right. Okay.
So unfortunately, I don't know that I'm going to be able to make any grand statements about
I was just curious if there was
enlightenment and relationship to health. But that was a huge thing. It shifted for me.
I'm wondering about conflict.
Okay.
So what does conflict look like in your relationship now?
Conflict. Okay. Um, in general, we haven't been people who've had a lot of conflict. Let me just say that, even since we did the day we met. But what I experience sometimes is I'll have a completely different way of how to approach something than he will. And I'm very detail oriented. I'm methodical. I like systems. I like to be prepared. I like to hang out with things to get to know them, and then, it takes me a while. And he's just very opposite. He's more like a maverick. He's really intuitive. He kind of has like a direct line to what he wants and what he knows, like immediately. And he's very decisive. He likes when a decision's done to have it be done. And I'm the kind of person who could decide something, and then after hanging out with it for a while, I could see that maybe that's not the best approach, and I've really worked it all out, and I'll come up with a better approach, and he'll think it's already been done or something. So our styles are so completely different that would be a time where we might come into conflict, if you want to call it that. Basically, it would just be like moments of frustration and, like, wait a minute, didn't we like go through this? Or it might be something he said, and I might say, well, didn't you think about that or this detail, or, what's happening with that? And, so we each have our areas of frustration where the other person's style isn't meeting up with ours. So that would be probably the primary area for us, for sure.
And then when those styles don't meet up and you're feeling something, a little bit of anger or some frustration, angst, what have you, what happens? Does it come out? Do you express it? Does it get subsumed? Like what happens with that experience?
Well, both of us we're not people who like thrive on conflict. We would, we kind of like it more quiet and just, so we probably wouldn't like blow up type thing. But what I'll tend to do is want to talk it through. And I just kind of learned over the years that it might be better just to just listen and let me talk it through, and he'll be listening. And then I'll often ask him, like, what do you think at this point, like after I've said all this? And then he'll either like repeat himself, like from where he started, and after having factored in everything I said, or like, well, I still want it to go this way, or I still think we should approach it this way, or he'll factor in what I've said and give me another update, of a new thing. So that's really typical. I don't know that that's very interesting, but that's pretty typical. If he feels like we're going in circles and we're not getting anything done, he'll sometimes just say, I think I'm done with this for now. And he'll get up and leave. And I'll typically just kind of hang out with it, because I'm very kinesthetic, and I just sometimes have to like try stuff on inside energetically and just kind of work it through until things clarify for me.
Yeah. The reason, to give you some context, that I'm interested in this topic is my experience is that some kind of conflict is just inevitable in in the human experience and definitely in romantic relationships. Something
Mm-hmm.
about romantic relationships tends to bring up the deepest, most unresolved
Mm-hmm.
what have yous that
Yeah.
need to be, I don't know if they need to be worked with, but want to be worked with.
Yeah.
They tend to just come up.
Yeah.
Maybe it's because our armor is down with one another when we're that close, or
Mm-hmm.
there's psychological theories that we come together for that purpose with one another.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So anyway, it seems as if conflict is inevitable, and yet it and if you avoid the conflict, you don't develop.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And I'm wondering, and so that's why I'm curious about what conflict looks like for you. Um, do you see where I'm going? Do you see why?
Yeah.
Does that make sense
Mm-hmm.
to you
Yeah, it
from
does.
your perspective? And so I guess I'm also curious if you think that's true. Like, do people need conflict in order to deepen a relationship?
I don't think so.
No.
Um, but I think anything can be a means. I don't know about anything, but just off the top of my head, like a working theory, it's possible that anything could be means for deepening.
Well, what do you mean?
Well, it it almost seems like it's our very nature to deepen. Um, especially, well, one way to speak about deepening would be to become more conscious, um, to be less prone or bound by our, egoic conditioning, you could say. So there's often, like, just, it seems like there's just this inherent movement in life to, and sometimes it comes in the brand of suffering that knocks on our door, that lets us know to wake up, like what's happening hurts, it's painful, and so there's this automatic push in life to have us be more conscious, more awake, more clear, and less deluded. And so, because it seems so inherent in life, it seems like it's kind of built in, this kind of deepening, if we think of deepening as becoming more conscious. And if there's not suffering, and there's things are relatively smooth, there still, in my experience, seems to be a great deepening of the felt sense of the undivided state, you could say. That it just becomes more rich and more vibrant of presence, more profound, more clear, and that I don't know that I don't expect there's an end to that.
There's no end. How does that dovetail with the concept of intimacy?
Well, beautifully, it can.
Because doesn't intimacy require duality?
Well, I mean, when we're in form, duality is sort of the almost like the ground rules here on planet Earth. But if you're talking about division, when you say duality, I don't think intimacy requires being in divided state or operating through a dualistic thought or mind. I mean, the mind can be completely silent, and there can be deep intimacy. In fact, in my experience, more profound intimacy. But it could, be thought of as spoken of as union versus intimacy, or
I guess
yeah.
that's what I'm thinking through as I'm asking the question. Well, yeah. Well, what is intimacy? In fact, what is intimacy with another human? What do you think?
Oh, okay. I didn't know if it was rhetorical. Um, well, that's the funny thing is when you say what do you think, like my first thing is like, oh yeah, like, well, intimacy is when you're not thinking. you know, there's no narration, there's no like, I want it to be this way, not this way. I mean, all of that gives way to the spontaneity of the moment,
Yeah.
But that's one working definition. I mean, we could probably come up with several.
Yeah. I mean, I'm not trying to get too heady about it, but I'm thinking about, a relationship with another person requires that there's two people.
Mm-hmm.
And understanding a person requires that you don't already understand them, or that you're not already one thing.
Yeah, yeah. So kind of more in the relative experience.
Well, but also, I could just ask anybody on the street.
Yeah.
What's intimacy, and how do you get to know a person that you don't know very well and deepen with them, right?
Mm-hmm.
But you have a different perspective because you've also had an experience of, well, I don't know how you put it, but of not having a self.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And also this awakening that continues to blossom and unfold for you for the last 18 years, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah.
Which, and again, I don't fully understand it from your view, but it sounds like it's been a letting go of attachment to your egoic, individuated self. Is that right?
You could say it that way. Yeah. I mean, the initial awakening, it's kind of like that letting go happened. But then as some of the patterns came back and layered on, I had this different perspective where I could really see them. Like, oh, look at that. And that's happening. It wasn't like, wasn't the same as before where I was so identified with my ego that I didn't even see its workings. So after the realization, I could see the workings more and be more present to how they were hooking up, and be more present to be able to see how they can unhook and stuff like that.
So in this place of where a lot of them are unhooking, from that place, how do you explore intimacy with another separate being? I mean, what even is it?
Well, each person's different. Like in my personality, I would tend to share with people who are close to me what's happening. As more years go by, I share a lot less because I'm not even so interested in it myself. It's not that I don't care to be like as skillful as I can in the world or as clear as I can, but the me that would be trying to do dismantling or be on a self-fix-it project is just become so much quieter that it's not really the central theme anymore.
And that same you that's getting quieter and quieter, I think is the same you that probably wanted to get married.
Maybe, yeah.
It seems like that's the identity that you and that me is the one that is mostly talking to other people most of the time. When we're all out,
yeah.
we're all out having relationships with each other.
Right.
And being angry and being in love and being excited that we made money. And
I get where you're going with it. Yeah.
And so as that starts to drop away, but you're still in a marriage, what's left?
Well, I think of it as like essence. So, and that's what really wanted to get married in the beginning was, I think there's all different kinds of marriages, but how I would speak of the hallmark of my marriage would be that the essence of what I am would light up in proximity to the essence of what Adya is, even before, like way back in our 20s, right? There's just that feeling that, yeah, I don't know that there's a better word for it, because some people might call it the soul. But I would just say like the very essence of what, like, my spirit would just like light up. And so it was a attraction of spirit to spirit. Whereas some people will say like it's more a soulmate, you know, who they have a past with, or somebody would say they have a big heart love attraction. You know, some people would say they'd have an intellectual, you know, met their intellectual match. But for us, it was just like spirit to spirit. Like that's what recognized each other.
Well, that's it for part 1 of our interview with Mukti, folks. Thanks for listening. Be sure to tune in Thursday to hear Mukti's thoughts on love and intimacy, and to hear my absolute, hands down, favorite this or that game ever recorded. I basically designed 2 of these questions just for Mukti. If you'd like to learn more about Mukti or her teachings, you can find her at adyashanti.org, and I'll put a link directly to her page on that site in our show notes. And Adyashanti is spelled ADYASHANTI.org. If you liked what you heard on our show today, please subscribe to us on iTunes. It makes a huge difference when you do that. And please also consider donating to our Patreon campaign. We're on a mission to crush shame, as you know, and every penny really helps. You can find that at patreon.com/together. If you have any questions or comments, or if you'd like to be on the show, please reach out to us via one of our platforms. You can find our website at www.together.guide. Our Facebook page is facebook.com/togethershow. Twitter and Instagram are both at together_show, or you can email me at host@together.guide. Our producer is Charlene Goto. Our web designer is Courtney Munna. Our art director and my one and only is Aubrey Pick. Thanks once again to my guest, Mukti. It was such a pleasure to meet with you. I look forward to the next time. That's all for today, folks. See you next time.